Okay, so it's actually the database administration workshop, and I want us to talk about this just to highlight or to make some recap on what we did, the Oracle database architecture. And we did mention that in Oracle database architecture, it's actually subdivided into 3 components. Number 1, we have memory. Number 2, we have background process or background processes. And number 3, we had storage structures. We had storage structures, whether you call it database storage structures or storage structures, it's the same. So what happens is, for database, we need to have a combination of all these 3 components, because a memory has to work hand in hand with the background processes, and background processes has to work hand in hand with the storage structures. Now, if you remember very well, we had like 2 types of memory. These are the main types, the 2 types of memory. So I'm going to give like that. So number 1, or A, in memory, we have something called the shared global area. And number 2, which is B, we had something called the program global area. Program global area. Now, these are the 2 types. These are the 2 types of memory. And for background processes, we have so many. We have so many background processes. For example, we have DBWR, which stands for database writer. We have LGWR, which stands for log writer. We had SMON, which stands for system monitor. We had PMON, which stands for process monitor. We also have CKPT, which stands for checkpointer, We also have something like called SCARC, which stands for archival process. We also have something called the RECO, which is recovery process, and so many other processes. So these are background processes which actually link the memory and the storage structures or the database storage structures. Now, for the database or for the storage structures, we have to, it's actually subdivided into 2. That is the database storage structures. We have the major storage structures, which actually involves data files, and these are the main ones. Data files, we have control files, and we have online redo log files. Online redo log files. Now, these are the major ones. Still, we have the minor ones, but still they are what? They are the database storage structures. So why are they called minor? It's because they depend on the major ones. They depend on the major ones. So for this one, we have something called the backup files. This means that it has to take any backup file or wherever, anytime you do a backup to your database, it is always going to be reserved as a backup files. We also have parameter files. Parameter files, I think I'm going to show you that. We also have something called the trace files. We also have something called the alert files. And of course, we have something called the password files. So I think all this makes up, or all this actually makes up the database storage structures. So remember, this one is just a recap because already I think we mentioned part of some of these things before. So it's good that we mention it once again, so that as we move to probably the next phase, we have a clue of what is happening. But this is not the end of talking about the Oracle database architecture components. We will still now dig more in depth into each one of them. For example, for the shared global area, that is the SGA, and it is the main memory, We will talk about the components that are involved. We will also talk about the components that are involved in program global area, which actually also referred to as PGA. We will also talk about the background processes. We will also talk about the storage structures and how they are created. For example, how can I come up with a data file? How can I come up with the control files? How can I come up with an online redo log files? So these are things that we will talk about them as we move forward. Now, something I want us to talk about it today is about managing storage, managing database instance, managing database instance. Now, when we talk about managing database instance, what do we mean? Remember, when we talk about an instance or a database instance is a combination or database instance comprised of DB memory plus BG processes or background processes. So when you have a combination of database memory and background processes, then we can also say or combine both of them and call them a database instance. Now for this case, my database name is ORCL. Your database name may also be ORCL, or it may be either, any other name. Now, that means the name of your database is that. At the same time, the name of your database instance is that. Because a database instance is always represented by a single name. And this name means that, or a database instance must always have a database memory and a background processes. So this is unique to each database. Now, it will reach a point when we will talk about something called multi-tenant architecture. Remember this one, you're talking about the Oracle database architecture. Now, in other words, this is also referred to as a single database architecture. This is also referred to as a single database architecture. So what means, or what this means is that as a single architecture, it is being represented by a single instance. That means it's only a single name. That database has only a single name. It is ORCL. And that becomes a single database architecture. Now, when later on in our course, we will talk about multiple database or multi-instance database architecture, which in other words is actually called container database. So we will talk about something called the CDB and PDB and something called the seed or PDB seed. So this amounts to something called a multi-instance architecture, or in other words, multi-tenant architecture. So this is where we have more than one database. And by that, I mean, we have more than one name, one database instance. You will have ORCL, you will have ORCL2, ORCL3, ORCL4. All those represents a single database, but they are all combined together. So when we talk about a CDB, it stands for container database. It stands for container database or multi-tenant container database, in other words, but it stands for container database. PDB stands for pluggable database. Pluggable database. That means you can plug a database. You can add an instance to a container which already has other instances. Now, for the seed, we will also talk about this one. This one is a template. You see, for you to have a CDB or for you to create a multi-instance architecture or multi-tenant architecture, you need first of all to configure your database to CDB. That means it should be a container database. After being a container database, you should have something called a seed. Now, this seed is always a template. It will act as a template for you to create more PDBs, because PDB is a pluggable database. So, and a pluggable database is equals to your database, which is ORCL. For that particular database you have as ORCL, that is a single instance. But when it comes to a CDB or to a container, then each instance is referred to as a pluggable database. So just have in mind that a seed or PDB seed is a template, PDB is a single instance database, and CDB is now the container. So we will talk about this thing called the multi-instance architecture. But for now, I want us we are still concentrating on a single instance architecture. Because if I look at the name, the database name for my database, it's actually ORCL. I don't have any CDB within me, because for that, we need to do some configurations on our database so that we can end up having a multi-tenant architecture. So for this case, we want to understand, first of all, how do we manage database instance? And managing database instance means that how can we start our database? How can we stop our database? How can we, of course, shut down our database and so many other things? So that is how we can manage database instance. So number one, we want to understand how can we start our database and how can we stop our database. So we have ways of starting up a database, and we also have advantages and disadvantages. And of course, we have, especially when it comes to stopping a database, you see, you have to know which type of database shutdown should I use? And this database shutdown should be secure for my data. So we have the shutdown mode that is, let's say, it's not safe for your database, or is not safe for you to use as you work on a production environment. So those are the things that I want us to look at and see how we can work out. So in this case, I'm going to clear my my window here, SCR, and I want us to connect as a super user. Now, when it comes to starting database, you see, we have a database storage structure. We have a database storage structure which always configures how our database instance is started up. And by this, I mean, we had this minor, database storage structure, which is actually called the parameter file. And this parameter file contains are of two types. Number one, we have something called the SP file. And number two, we have something called the P file. SP file stands for server parameter file. P file stands for parameter file, but in other words, it stands for text initialization. This is the full, like you can have text initialization parameter file. Why text? It's because this file and this file is equal in terms of their contents, in terms of their performance. But in this case, the P file is actually referred to as text initialization because it is readable. People can actually read, especially us as users. With us to access, or for us to access this parameter file, we are accessing it by P file because it is in a readable format. SP file is only meant to be read by the system because why? It is in binary format. So the way we start our database is always started by the SP file. These are the two parameters that tells us how we can start our database. Now, by default, when you install the database software for the first time, you will end up having the SP file. P file is not anywhere to be seen. So what happens is you have to recreate P file, not even recreate, but you have to create P file from the existing SP file, So what happens here is that the SP file is important, and also the P file is important because either of the files can miss. What SP file can miss. So if it misses, how can you start the database instance? You need to start the database instance with a P file. What happens if P file is not there? You have to start the database instance using SP file. But by default, because once we have the database software installed and SP file is always there, then it means that our database is always started by SP file. Now, I know it's not a normal thing for us to start the database at any time because once I issued connect/assist DBA and it tells me connected, then there's no need for me to do what? To start the database because the database is already up and running. But there are scenarios where you'll be forced to start the database. You see, by default now, yes, I have connected Assist DBA, but have I really started up my database or have I really shut down my database? For this case, my database is always up and running. You see, shutting down the database for this case, this does not mean that I have to shut down the SQL Plus or this platform by closing or by just closing or clicking the X icon. No, that does not actually shut down the database. So for me to shut down the database, I need to issue a command. And to issue the command, I need to type the word what? Shut down. But we always have this kind of shutdown immediate. So let me start with shutdown because already we have this shutdown. And before even shutdown, remember I talked about starting your database using the SP file. So if at all, if you try to connect, because at some point, if you try to connect to the database Assist DBA, instead of it telling you connected, it tells you what? Connected to an idle instance. Now, if at all you've encountered this error, don't worry, because we have a remedy to it. And this remedy is being done or is being performed by a background process called SMON. So system monitor. So what happens is, once you encounter this particular error, your database will not be available unless you do what? You start up. So what happens is, let's first of all see how we can experience that thing or that error. So shutdown. So the one way of shutting down the database or ensuring that the database is shut down is you use the word shutdown immediate. And have this in mind that shutdown immediate is one of the types of shutting down a database. Of course, we have other three. We will talk about them. So shutdown immediate. So here it means that if I press enter, my database now is going to be shut down. Now, it's not a must or mandatory for me to use the word shut down. I can use the word what? Shu immediate or SHU immediate. So it's actually the same. Whether you give it in short, SHU, or you give it in full, shut down, it will still work. So if I press enter, you can see now that this has started to blink, and it's going to ensure that the three components are taken care of. That means what? The memory has to be closed. The Oracle instance has to be closed. The database instance, all those. So it's going to take you like probably a minute before it starts. And this means that it has to take care of everything. So look at that. The database has been closed. The database has been dismounted, because always when the database is up and running, it is in mount stage. And down here, it will be now the Oracle instance. So let's see what will follow. Now, this is the process of doing what? Shutting down the database. So you can see we have 3 stages that the database has to read before the database is closed or is shut down. So this is the surest and safest way to shut down the database, rather than closing the what? Closing the terminal. So closing this terminal does not guarantee you that the database is closed. No, the database will still be up and running. But when you issue the word show immediate or any other type of shutdown, then the database will know that everything has been brought to an halt. So here it means that the first query is that the database closed, the database is mounted, and the Oracle instance shut down. When it comes to opening the database or starting up the database, you will see all these being the opposite. It will start from the Oracle instance open or started, database mounted, and then database open. Now, let me see whether we can experience that error. So for this one, I will try to do what? To start con/assistdb. Press enter. Let's see what will open. Look at that. That is the error I'm talking about. So connected to an idle instance. Connected to an idle instance. So what could be the issue here? You see the issue here. This actually has not given you any error or any hint that what has happened. But you, as a DBA, you must know that the database is already down or it's already closed or shut down. So what happens is you need to do what? You need to start. And the only way to start this database is to use the SP file. So to use the SP file, you need to issue the word what? Startup. Startup means you are telling the system, go and read the parameter file. That means the SP parameter file, not the P file. Read the parameter file. For the P file, if P file exists, you have to provide the path to P file. For example, if I'm to use the P file now, I need to do what? Start a P file and then put that, and then you mention the path, you see? So you have to mention the path and then you close. But for this case, we don't have the P file. The only thing I have is, okay, just a minute. So what happens is, when it comes to this, you can use 2 things or 2 ways to start up your database, especially by using the SP file. You can decide to issue the word startup alone, or use the word startup force. So startup force is more faster than startup. But of course, both of them are SP file. Both of them will point to SP file. So in this case, I need to provide the word startup. So if I press enter, it will now give me the opposite of what? So I want you to look keenly how it will give me. It will give me the opposite of this: database closed, database dismounted, Oracle instance shut down. So it will start with what? The last line, Oracle instance shut down. So again, it requires patience. As it blinks, it is trying to do some background check before it gives us some messages here. So this is the message, and this is number 1 error that you can experience, and which can force you to issue the word startup. And of course, we have other ways. We have other reasons why we should start the database. You see, starting up the database can lead you to, can actually follow based on the factors that you want. For example, Here I've experienced an error code connected to another instance. I am forced to issue startup. Now I want to do something called incomplete recovery of the database. I need to use startup. Now, if I want to probably perform some, to recover some files or missing files, at some point I'll be required to use startup. So let's see, now you can see. So Oracle instance started. And here it's trying to give us some of the components of the memory. Here you can see that we have this SGA. I think we also have something called the database buffers, the redo log buffers. And the first here is Oracle instance started. This, after shutdown, this was the last thing to be talked about. So what follows is now database mounted. Is now database mounted. You see database mounted, and then the last one is database open. Is database open. So let's see. So that is the last point to tell us database opened. So you see, we shut down the database, and after issuing call/assist_dba, it gives us this connected to an idle instance. Now we've successfully managed to start the database. Now let me issue again the word, just try to connect as a super user. You can see it is actually giving me connected. So for this one, no worries. It means that my database is up and running. And what I've done so far, because we are supposed to talk about probably the types of shutdowns and the types of starting, or how to start the database and what could be the reasons behind it, is that we have, let me talk about the startup. Yes, any question so far? Okay, yeah, I've noticed, I don't know about my network. Are you getting me now? Okay, I've noticed that there's an issue with my network. So what happens is, when it comes to startup or starting up database, starting database has like three methods. One is startup nomount. Another one is startup mount. And then another one is open. You see, like database open. So these are 3 stages. And 3 stages is when you break the word startup. You see, remember, if you break this, if you break the word startup, cite that you want to go step by step. Remember, startup is a general term that covers all these 3 stages. All these 3 stages. So if you want to start your database, if you want to start your database in bits, then you can undergo the three stages. Now, this does not mean that going through them is harmful. No. Going through them means that you have an intention of performing a specific task. And every stage here is important. Every stage here is important. Now, remember, if you want to perform some backups, you see, there are files that needs to be adjusted. If you need to perform something called Flashback Technologies, and Flashback Technologies means that if mistakenly you drop a table and you want to bring them back, you just use a Flashback technology to bring them back. But to use Flashback technology, you need to enable the Flashback technology feature. So that means that the only way to enable that is to start your database at startup mount. That is the only point you can adjust that. Again, if you want to perform some recoveries or you want to perform some backup, we have something called archived log or archive log file. If that file is disabled or is in disable mode, you cannot be able to perform backups and recoveries until you enable that feature while the database is at startup mount. So you see how important startup mount is. So that is about the starting. Now let me give you the stopping. We'll do them practically. Stopping database. Now the stopping database, you see there's difference between working individual. Let's say, for example, you are learning a database or you're actually doing a database in class, or you have only a database to play with just to see what is happening. And we have a database in production environment, such as bank. So shutting down or stopping the database means that you have to be very careful, because data is very important, or data is of paramount importance. So what happens is the way you use this, the types of shutdowns depends. Which shutdown is more safer? Which shutdown is more harmful? So this is at the types of shutdown. For example, we have shutdown immediate. That is the one we've used. We have shutdown abort. We have shutdown normal. Then we also have shutdown transactional. Shutdown transactional. So these are the four types of what? Stopping a database or shutting down the database. Then we have the three types of starting a database. Now, when you start, I want us to go step by step. And for this one, let me just press enter, and don't worry about the error that is going to be caused. I'll explain them one by one. So we have startup nomount. What happens at startup nomount? You see, startup nomount means that the parameter files are started. This is an area where the parameter files are started. And remember, before you use startup nomount, startup mount, database open, or you want to start the database, what could be the default mode for your database? So the default status for your database is that the database should first be closed, or should already be, is actually closed. So that means the database is shut down at first, because now you intend to start up the database. So you cannot start something which is already started. So that means we have to ensure that the database is shut down. So let me just use one of them, the shut immediate, so that I can explain. Let us put the database at shut SHU immediate. And I know probably you've seen me using SHU immediate. Now this is the second time. Why am I using it? So there's an advantage to that. So database closed, database dismounted, and then Oracle instance shut down. So it is only when the database is shut down, that is the only point you can start the database. So there's no way that you can start an already started database. It will give you an error. It will give you an error telling you that the database is already up and down. Now, so let me show you how to start up nomount. So you see now that my database is asleep. So I need to start the database by invoking the parameter files, which means that I'm invoking the SP file. So I will just issue the word startup, nomount, press enter, startup, nomount. Here, the SP file, the parameter files are going to be activated. And once activated, these parameter files are going to look for a file called control file. If you remember the control file is a very important file. It is a critical file to the database because it contains all the information related to the database. That means It contains the database name. It contains the database configuration files. All of them are kept by the control files. So here at startup nomount, it means that the P file or the SP file are going to be looked at. Once they are found, then it is the work of the SP file and P file to look for the control file. To look for the control file. So this, all of them means we need some patience, because now the database is trying to analyze itself before it gives us the results. So now something unique. You see, when you start the database at nomount, probably you are targeting something. Look at this. So it means that I'm only aligning myself to what? Oracle instance started. So startup nomount, it's only the Oracle instance started. And if you go to this point, where was it? If I take you back to this point, where we were able to issue the word startup, you could see that we have the Oracle instance started. And then we also have the database mounted, and we have the database opened. All these were covered under the keyword startup. But now, if you come down here, as I try to start my database at nomount, it means that it's only the Oracle instance that has been started. That means no database has been mounted, no database has been opened. You see? So this is startup nomount. Now, we don't actually have a lot of advantages starting up the database at nomount compared to starting the database at mount stage. So starting the database at mount or mount stage is important even compared to nomount, because there's a lot of activities that are going to happen at at mount stage. So a question is probably that is almost being asked by Brian here. What happens if I immediately have started at nomount stage? What happens if I start up mount stage? What will happen? Am I going to have the database mounted? Am I going to have the database mounted or not? Now, let me press enter and see what is open. Now, if I press enter, look at that. Cannot start, already running Oracle. Shut it down fast. The good thing about this database or the Oracle database, it always gives us some hint, especially when an error is displayed. So this means what? The only way for you to start up nomount stage is for you to shut down the database. The only way to start up mount stage is again for you to shut down the database. So there's no way that you will shut down the database, start up nomount, then start up mount. So what you will do is shut down the database. So shutdown immediate, press enter. And once the database is shut down, if I issued the word startup mount, this time round, it will act as, you see, the database not mounted, show immediate database not mounted. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay. So what happens is, if I shut down the database and then start up mount, this means that the process would have already surpasses the nomount stage. So the nomount stage is included or is integrated in the mount or in the startup mount. So there's no need for us to go through the nomount so that we can end up at mount. Immediately after shutdown, if you start a mount, nomount is already taken care of. So let me start up mount. And you can see that the database is is blinking. So this means that the Oracle database instance is going to be started and the database mounted. Remember, we had like 3 steps. We had like 3 steps: startup, nomount, startup, mount, and then open. So for you to start up nomount, you have to shut down the database. For you to start up mount, you have to shut down the database. But for you to start to issue database open or to open the database, no need for you to shut down the database. As long as you are at startup mount, that means you're able to issue the word open. And of course, the way we issue the command for open is not just the way, just like open, you will actually issue it using one of the DDL. If you remember the alter database open, alter database open. So when it comes to starting up this, you have to be a little bit patient because it's going to blink, 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 and then gives you some results. Yes, Fred. Yes. 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 Okay. So these are the, yes. 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 Okay. Now, compared between the two, okay, the most important concepts, especially the three areas, between the startup nomount, startup mount, and open. Now, what happens is for startup nomount, if at all you have a problem with the control files, let's say, for example, the database storage structures, or you've experienced a media failure. I know we will talk about the failures. And when you talk about the media failure, I'm talking about either the loss of either one of the data files, loss of one of the control files, loss of one of the online redo log files, one of the redo log files. Now, either of this is actually caused by something called the media failure. Now, if at all you lose data file, you lose control file, you lose online redo log files, and you want to perform a recovery of either of these, then it means that your database should always be at the no mount. So you have to switch the database to no mount. And that is the point where we can try to recover these files. This is only tied to the media failure. And of course, this does not mean that in mount stage, we may not, we may not recover some of these files. It's only at no mount stage that some of the media failures can be recovered. Although it's not a major thing, or we may not even end up using more of no mount compared to at mount stage. So just to know that at no mount, in case of any media failure and you want to recover, of course, we look at this practically later, then we have to switch our database to no mount. Now, that is no mount. When it comes to mount stage, if you want to perform database recovery, for example, a whole backup, you want to perform backup, we have a file called archive log. Now, if you want to perform Flashback Technologies, we have to enable Flashback. Now, for example, if I can take you through the archive log, if now my database is not open, but let me just open so that you can see alter database open. This is how we open the database. So it will tell us database opened. And you can see after issuing the startup mount, it has given me database mount. And this one has actually combined the stage for no mount and database mount. Now, suppose you want to perform then database altered. So this means that the database is open now. Now, suppose you want to perform backup. You want to perform backup. Now, to perform a backup, we have a requirement. And the requirement is that something must be enabled. And that thing is referred to as the archive log. Archive log. Now, if I come here and check something called the archive log list, I want to check the status of that thing. Now, look at this. Archive log list. It means that the database log mode, okay, the automatic archival is actually enabled. Now, by default, especially when if you look at your database and check archive log list, by default, I think it is disabled. Now, so if it is disabled, for you to enable this archive log mode so that you can be allowed to perform a recovery, you are supposed to do what? You are supposed to be at mount stage. So there's no way that you can perform that without being at mount stage. So that is the importance of that. And practically, you have to shut down the database again. So there's no way that you can get to this mount stage without shutting down the database. So unless you've not issued the word alter database open. But as long as you're still under the mount stage, that is the only point you can do what? You can enable the archive log mode. So that is one scenario, Fred, where you're required to, for your database to be at mount stage for you to change, or for you to change that configuration file so that you can do what? You can perform a backup. So now if I come back here, startup mount, this will give me now a platform to change a lot of things. Now, that is number one reason probably as to why you should, or why are you required to be at startup mount. Another reason is for you to perform something called incomplete recovery. Incomplete recovery. Incomplete recovery means that either of the files, especially the storage structure files or the database storage structures, have been lost. And that is the same case to, the control files, the online redo log files, the data files. Remember, you can still do that at no mount, but again, you can still do them at startup mount. So some of the failures that can occur within the database can force you to be a startup mount so that you can perform something called incomplete recovery. Now, the opposite of incomplete recovery is complete recovery. So for you to perform complete recovery, of course, your database should be up and running, and the archive log mode or the archive log should always be enabled, So since it is enabled, for my case, I'm actually starting my database at mount stage. And probably my intention is to do what? Is to disable the archive log. That means I don't want anyone to perform what? To perform any backup. I don't want anybody to perform any backup. So since I am at startup mount stage, I can decide now to do what? I can decide now to change. So alter database, no archive log. This is how the opposite of that. So archive log mode, this means enabled. Disabled means no archive log. So if I press enter, you can see database altered. But now when I come to this, like to ensure that the database is open now, because immediately after startup mount, making my changes, the next is to ensure that the database is up and running. So remember, based on my my previous display of the archive log list, if I can go back here, press now, now you can see that the automatic archival has been disabled. So for this one, it means that I am unable to perform backup. I am unable to perform backup, even as long as the database is up and running. But as long as the feature is disabled, then I may not be able to do that. So to do the reverse, it means that I need to go back again, shut down the database, start up mount, alter database, archive lock. This time round is archive lock. And then you alter database open, and your database or the file is enabled. So I think 90%, I think I've explained, Fred. Yes. Yes. Now. Yes. Yes. Now, so if, for example, we have, especially when it comes to backup, we have, let me like one good example. When it comes to doing backups, or even talk about the types of backups, we have something called hot backup and cold backups, or at some point we have online backups and offline backups. Now, hot or online backups, these are backups that are being done while the database is up and running. That means you can do backup as the people are using, as the users are there. At the same time, you can do a backup while the database is shut down. That is an offline backup. So that is, and the reason why you're doing it is because of the interference. You don't want any interference while the backup is taking place. So that is one big reason why the database should be at shutdown. And majority of the people, they always prefer doing database offline because all the files are stopped, like no interference at all. So such scenarios will actually force you to shut down the database. So probably that is one good example. And of course, we will see other as we move forward. So when it comes to, most of the time is through the backup recovery processes. You see, even the recovery, we have the physical recovery. We have the physical recovery of the database files. For that, physical recovery means you have to right-click on a file, copy, put it here. Copy that, cut, put it here. You see, you're trying to repair a database. So for that, you don't need to have the database online. You need to have the database at standstill so that you copy paste, and then now you start the database and see whether it's working. So those are probably the two scenarios where database should be shut down. And of course, it's always good again to shut down, like just for, just to keep it safe, and that is the only way. Although we have databases that must be alive, must be live, especially databases that are connected to the servers, and there are a lot of files going on. And it's, again, it is very rare at some point even to put off this the database, because why? You see, there are some backup that are automatic, or there are backups that needs to be done, or an auto backup. It's like giving some instructions to the database that ikifika masaa hii, start the backup, and the backup will run all through the night until kitu kama saa 10 asubuhi, then it stops. So you see, and after it stops, the database should be shut down for now the DBAs to clear up the database and ensure that the database is available to users as new as it is, and isilete hiccups again. So kuna hiyo breakdown, like database lazima isimamishwe, shut down ya mwisho, Yeah, such scenarios. Okay. Okay. Automatically. Yeah. Yes. Uh, no. But at some point, it depends now how critical it is. Because if it's critical, probably at some point you may be forced even to shut down the database. But most of the time we have repairs that can be done online. We have repairs that can be done offline. Yeah, especially the control file. You see, the control file is more of like the brain. So you need to stop it and see what happens. Just the same way mtu anafanyiwa ile operation. Yeah, so that is it. And so we have like the 3 stages. We don't have like 4 stages of starting up the database, because most of us can decide even to include the shutdown as part of starting up the database. No, starting up database always starts at nomount, then goes to mount, and then open database. So unless there's some changes you want to make that forces you to start up at mount stage, that is the only time you can make some adjustments before you issue alter database open. And let's all embrace this. Like, in case of an error, just try reading between the lines. There's always be an hint towards the error that is being given to you or displayed. So now, when it comes to the shutdown, we have immediate, which I've actually used. Shutdown, of course, abort. The shutdown transactional, and then shutdown. Now, when it comes to the database, we have, you see the way we are executing our statements, we are performing something called, it's actually transactions. You see, the word transactions can only be fixed to a bank. But in this case, as long as we are doing or executing SQL statements, all these are transactions. Yes, they are queries, but in other words, they're transactions. And the database tends to keep record of all of them. So here we are talking about the shutdown, not shutdown, shutdown. So what happens is, based on these shutdowns, the question is, what could be the best way of shutting down the database? And talking about the best, what is the best and safest, you see? So we are not even talking about the best, we're talking about the safest. Which is the safest way to shut down the database? Now, remember, there are 2 things here. When shutting down the database, number 1, we are looking at the connections, the new connections. What will happen to the new connections? Now, the new connections means after I shut down the database, am I able to connect as HR? Am I able to connect as probably Fred, if we have a database such as that? You see, those are connections. So you need to characterize these types of shutdown based on the following conditions. 1, new connections. Number 2, the current transactions. You see, what will happen to the current transactions? Because as you decide to shut down the database, remember there are current transactions that are being done. For example, in the bank, this is around, okay, saini saa moja, but probably some few hours ago, bank inafunganga for that. And tuseme, database inafungwa, inakuwa shut down at 5 p.m. So what will happen to the current transactions, the immediate current transactions that happened? Now, and number 3 of this is now the speed. We can talk about the speed of the shutdown type. Now, let me speak about the 2, the new connections and the current transactions. Now, when we talk about the shutdown immediate, let's assume that we are all in a bank and somebody has done some transactions. That is 5 minutes before shutdown. And he forgets to to commit. You see, there's that way of making permanent changes into the database by issuing the word commit. So what will happen if someone forgets to commit 5 minutes to the time when the database is expected to be shut down? Now, for shutdown commit, first of all, no new connection will be allowed. You see, after issuing the word the shutdown or show immediate, no new connection will be allowed until that process is over. And even after that process is over, it's only until the database is started up. That is when new connections are allowed. But in all of this, let me summarize, in all of this, no new connections is allowed. Now, the current transactions. So the no new connections cuts across all of them. Current transactions. Now, what will happen to the current transactions? Now, for shutdown immediate, for this one, it will wait. It will wait for current transactions to finish. It will wait for current transactions to finish. You see, for example, if they were not even talking about commit, but if they were bulk updates, remember at some point you may end up having a bulk update. That means there are so many files that needs to be updated, and the system is trying to process one at a time. So for shutdown immediate, it will wait for current transactions to end. Now, this means that it's not only shutdown immediate, both shutdown immediate and shutdown transactional are the same. In terms of what? In terms of it will wait for current transactions to end. It will wait for current transactions to end. Now, that does not also leave shutdown normal. Shutdown normal, at some point, it keeps on changing. But you'll find that, yes, as it waits for current transactions to end, this one will actually take a longer time. That's why we're talking about shutdown immediate, normal. For shutdown immediate and shutdown transactional, both of them will wait for current transactions to end, but itajaribu kuharakisha, you see. But for shutdown normal, this one will normalize things. And even if those bulk updates is required to probably happen or stay there for like even 10 hours, the shutdown normal is going to wait for all those 10 hours. So shutdown immediate and shutdown transactional are more faster. Shutdown abort does not care whether there are transactions in waiting mode or no transactions in waiting mode. Kama kuna bulk update and then you issue shutdown abort, then shutdown abort will wipe all the transactions to the last commit. So hata kama it's supposed to end for 10 hours, itafuta everything. So you have to be very careful when it comes to using shutdown abort. So these are two very important. No new connections to all of them. And then whether to wait for current transactions. For those that wait for current transactions to finish so that it shut down the database, is shutdown immediate, shutdown transactional, and shutdown normal. For shutdown abort, this one is a killer. It kills everything, or it stops all the transactions and terminates the database. Now, after leaving, because we've seen now the shutdown abort is not even important here. Unless you are in a hurry, you can just issue shutdown abort. But this means probably you are on your own, but in production environment, don't issue that. Shutdown immediate and shutdown normal. Now between the two, which one is more okay? Let me unganisha this. Shutdown transactional and shutdown normal versus shutdown immediate. So for shutdown immediate, this one is the safest. Is the safest way to this is actually the safest way to shut down the database, and it's actually the fastest. Let me just use these terms. It is the fastest and safest. It's fastest and safest way to shut down the database. Shutdown transactional, it is the cleanest but slowest. It is the cleanest but slowest. So yes, we can actually use all of them. They are okay to us. But you see, if you're saving time, then it means that shutdown immediate is good because it's the fastest, it's the fastest and it's the fastest. But for shutdown transactional and shutdown normal, is actually the cleanest but the slowest. So these are the types of shutdown or shutting down the database. So the same way to use shutdown, or the same way we've used shutdown immediate, is actually the same way you can use shutdown abort, shutdown transactional, and shutdown normal. So those are the two ways of starting a database and stopping a database, our database instance. Yeah, any question up to that point? And remember, we have the shortest route, like shoe immediate, shoe abort, shoe transactional, and shoe normal. So for our case, because our database is not busy, you can also try. Just issue shoe abort, shoe normal. But once you issue shoe abort, ensure you start up the data. You start up database. Just type the word startup. Shoe transactional, just issue the word startup. So because every time the database is down, you must bring it up before you put it down. Yeah, and yes. Oh, for your case, don't do it. Yes. It's an online, for your case, it's an online. Yes. Okay. No, it's not an online one. Yes, to install. As see when you to install. We'll go create a job. Usitupeleka mbali. Yeah. Okay, yeah, no, it's an offline, You can just practice on it. Ikileta shida, no problem. We can fix it. Yeah, so I think we can stop there. I think by tomorrow tutakuwa sawa. So yes, Brian. Data, yes. Nomount. Okay. So, okay. Ume shut down database. Ume shut down. Startup. Okay. Now, yes. Yes, kuna this process. Number one is that, okay, the database yako iko, let's say ume shut down. After starting shut down, unaamusha startup nomount. Now for this one, he naamusha only the Oracle instance or the Oracle database instance. Now, by instance, I mean it is the memory and background processes zimeamushwa tu. Now, ukitaka sasa kurudi kustart up at nomount, which means nomount iko na nomount ndani na at the same time iko na mount yake. So startup mount, So unaona kama sasa uko kwa startup no mount, this means before you start up mount, lazima we shut down the database again. Ndo urudi startup mount. So startup mounts, ita open sasa the Oracle, again, Oracle database instance, plus database mounted. So ita mount database. So it may include sasa the startup no mount. So that's why you have to shut down the database. And once you start up mount, if you want to make sure that the database is now open, usi shut down immediate again. Just alter database open. If you're to. Yes, after yeah, the second time. So unapata kuna hii, okay, unaweza tumia even the shortcut. Kuna show immediate plus startup no mount. Ama uende this one. Show immediate plus startup mount alafu plus alter database open. Hivyo. Yeah, so hii ni different. Lakini sasa hii ndio ukitaka hata kuconnect kwa HR unabidi sasa urudishe database yako vile ilikuwa, utaribidi run hii yes. Yeah. Alafu no mount is one word. Ndo nashuku hata kama umeweka space. So that is it. Okay, so I think we can stop there. See you tomorrow. I think Fred, I think kuna ile recording on Friday. Kwanza